The air in Uyo that morning was thick with an inexplicable tension, though the sky was a serene shade of blue. Ada stood at the entrance of her family home, clutching the edges of her chitenge wrap tightly, watching her parents and older brother load their belongings into the family's old sedan. Her heart was heavy, her chest tight with a sense of foreboding that she couldn't shake. She had spent the entire night dreaming of twisted metal, blaring horns, and the deafening silence that followed. It wasn't the first time Ada had such a vision, but it was the first time she had felt this powerless. "Please, Mama," Ada pleaded, her voice trembling. "Don't go. Something bad is going to happen." Mrs. Adderwale, her mother, turned to her with a patient smile, tucking a stray braid behind Ada's ear. "Ada, my child, don't let fear consume you. Your brother and I will only be gone for a few hours. Help out at the shop, Her father, Mr. Adderwale, chimed in from the driver's seat, his voice cheerful and reassuring. "We'll be back before you know it. Keep the house safe, Ada." Tunde, her older brother, leaned out of the car window, flashing his usual grin. "Don't burn the house down while we're gone," he joked, though the tension in Ada's expression made his smile falter. Ada felt a lump form in her throat as she watched them drive away. The vision replayed in her mind, a haunting warning of what was to come. She wanted to run after them, to scream louder, to do something to stop the inevitable. But instead, she stood frozen, the weight of her foresight pressing down on her shoulders. As the car disappeared down the dusty road, Ada's knees buckled. She fell to the ground, tears streaming down her face. She whispered under her breath, "God, please, keep them safe." As the day wore on, Ada tried to distract herself with household chores. She swept the compound, tended to the small garden her mother loved, and even attempted to read one of her father's old books. But the gnawing sense of dread refused to leave her. Every sound, the chirping of birds, the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of traffic seemed amplified, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Her vision replayed in her mind like a relentless loop. She could see the truck careening out of control, its brakes screeching, the screams of her family inside the car, and then the deafening crash. Ada squeezed her eyes shut, clutching her chest as if to hold herself together. By early evening, the dreaded news arrived. A neighbor, breathless and wide-eyed, rushed into the compound. "Ada! Ada!" the woman called, her voice laced with urgency. Ada stepped out, her hands trembling. "What is it?" she asked, though she already knew. The woman hesitated, her face twisted with sorrow. "It's your family. There was an accident, a truck. They didn't make it." The words hit Ada like a physical blow. She staggered back, her legs giving way beneath her. The world around her blurred as tears streamed down her face. "No, no, no, no," she screamed, her voice raw with anguish. As the neighbor recounted the details, Ada's vision of the crash played alongside the woman's words, each detail eerily accurate. The truck had lost control on a sharp bend, colliding head-on with her family's car. The impact had been instantaneous. Ada collapsed onto the ground, her cries echoing into the night. Her heart shattered, her worst fears realized. She clung to the memory of her family's smiles that morning, now knowing they were the last she would ever see. The funeral arrangements were somber and swift. Ada had no choice but to watch as her family's bodies were laid to rest, each moment dragging her further into the abyss of grief. Relatives and family friends came and went, their faces sympathetic, their voices a quiet murmur of condolences, but none of them could ease the aching emptiness in Ada's chest. The house, once filled with the sound of her father's laughter and her mother's gentle humming, now felt like a hollow shell. Ada wandered aimlessly from room to room, her eyes glazed over, as if searching for some fragment of her former life that had been erased in a moment of chaos. The clothes her mother had sewn, the chair where her father had sat every evening, the kitchen that smelled of her mother's cooking. All these things seemed like distant memories now out of reach. But amidst the haze of loss, there was one figure who remained, steady and imposing, Uncle Bayo. Her father's younger brother, with his broad shoulders and commanding presence, was a man of wealth and status in the city. His words were kind, almost too kind, as he offered to take Ada in, to care for her and protect her as if she were his own daughter. Ada, though still reeling from the tragedy, couldn't deny the cold knot in her stomach. Uncle Bayo spoke with authority, making quick decisions, his voice always calm, even in the face of such an overwhelming loss. As the funeral proceedings concluded and family members began to disperse, he took Ada aside. "We'll be heading to Abuja, Ada. You'll stay with me," he said, his tone firm but soothing. "You're part of my family now. I'll make sure you have everything you need, just like I promised your father." Ada nodded, unsure of what else to do. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on her chest, but she couldn't refuse. With no other family to turn to, Uncle Bayo was all she had left. But as she sat in the back of the car, heading to a life she hadn't chosen, Ada couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She looked out the window, watching the city fade behind her, and wondered if she was walking into a new chapter of her life, or if she was merely walking into a trap she couldn't escape. As the car pulled into the driveway of Uncle Bayo's mansion in Abuja, Ada's unease intensified. The large, imposing structure towered before her like a fortress, its polished walls and meticulously manicured lawns starkly contrasting with the grief-stricken girl who had just lost her entire world. The air felt heavier, suffocating in its silence. Uncle Bayo parked the car, the tires crunching on the gravel as he calmly got out. Ada hesitated for a moment before following, her eyes sweeping over the grand but intimidating estate. This was a far cry from the humble home she had shared with her parents in Uyo. Here, the air felt thick with power and isolation. The lush greenery surrounding the mansion only seemed to magnify the deepening pit in Ada's stomach. She wasn't sure if it was the house or the man leading her inside that made her feel so small, but it felt like she was walking into a world that was not her own. Inside, the grandness of the house only increased her discomfort. The high ceilings, polished wooden floors, and sleek furniture felt cold and sterile. There were no family photos, no warmth, no personal touches, just a series of clean, empty spaces. Ada walked behind Uncle Bayo through the sprawling hallways, her footsteps muffled by the luxurious carpets. The house was so quiet it almost felt alive, watching her every move. As they reached the staircase, Uncle Bayo paused and turned toward her. He gave her a smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "This is your new home, Ada. I'll make sure you have everything you need. You won't lack for anything here." His words were meant to comfort, but the lack of warmth in his voice did the opposite. Ada nodded, her throat tight with emotions she couldn't quite name. She didn't know how to respond. Everything about this house screamed unfamiliarity. It felt like a prison, but she had no choice. This was where she had to stay. "Your room is upstairs," Uncle Bayo said, gesturing toward the staircase. Ada followed, her heart pounding in her chest as she ascended the stairs. At the top, she was shown to a large, ornate room, its floor-to-ceiling windows revealing the sprawling estate below. The room itself was lavishly furnished, an ornate bed with silk sheets, a large wardrobe, and expensive artwork on the walls, but none of it brought her any comfort. "This is yours now. Make yourself at home," Uncle Bayo said, before leaving her to unpack. His voice lingered in the silence of the room long after he was gone. Ada sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling as she ran them over the expensive silk sheets. She couldn't shake the feeling that this new life, this new house, was the beginning of something much darker. The house was silent, and in that silence Ada could almost hear the echoes of her parents' voices, telling her to be strong, to stay safe. But how could she stay safe when she didn't even know what dangers lay ahead? She prayed quietly, holding her parents' memory in her heart, wishing for guidance, hoping for some sort of sign that she had not made a mistake. But the only sound in the room was the distant hum of the mansion's air conditioning and the quiet tick of a clock on the wall. Days turned into weeks, and slowly Ada began to settle into the routine of Uncle Bayo's mansion. Despite her discomfort, she tried to keep her mind focused on the promise of a better future he had given her. He enrolled her in school, provided her with the best clothes, and ensured she lacked for nothing material. Yet, with every passing day, an unsettling sense of foreboding gnawed at her. There was something off about Uncle Bayo, something she couldn't quite place. One evening, after a long day of school, Ada was in her room reading a book her mother used to read to her. She found a strange comfort in it, as if connecting with the past would somehow bridge the gap between her old life and the unfamiliar world she now inhabited. Suddenly she heard a knock on the door. It was Uncle Bayo, his figure blocking the light from the hallway. He smiled in his usual cold, measured way. "Ada, I brought you some tea," he said, his voice too calm, too smooth. "I thought you could use some rest." Ada hesitated, feeling a chill run down her spine. Something in the way he spoke made her uneasy, but she didn't want to be impolite. She stood and walked toward the door. As she opened it, Uncle Bayo entered without invitation, the door closing behind him. "Thank you, Uncle," Ada murmured, taking the tea, but her hand trembled slightly as she did. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Bayo sat on the edge of the bed, watching her closely as she sipped the tea. Ada tried to focus on the warmth of the liquid, but it felt like the warmth of the tea was unable to reach the chill in her bones. She quickly set the cup down. Uncle Bayo leaned closer. "You've been through so much, Ada. You're all alone now. I'm just trying to help you. I'm your only family left," he said, his words veiled with a false sense of tenderness. Ada's heart pounded in her chest. "I know, Uncle. I appreciate everything you've done for me," she replied, her voice trembling as she fought to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. But Bayo wasn't done. His hand brushed against her arm, sending an electric jolt of fear through Ada's body. He looked at her with a strange intensity, his gaze lingering a little too long. "Remember, Ada," he said softly, "you owe me everything now. I've taken you in, given you everything you need. You don't want to disappoint me, do you?" A cold dread washed over Ada as she realized what he was implying. She took a step back, her heart racing. "Uncle Bayo, I don't want any trouble." But it was too late. He was already reaching for her, his intentions clear. Ada froze, her mind spinning in confusion and terror. She had nowhere to run. She was trapped, and there was no one who could save her. Before he could make another move, Ada's instincts kicked in. She shoved him away, backing into the corner of the room, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "No, stop!" she cried out, her voice cracking with fear. Uncle Bayo's face darkened with anger. "You think you can resist me? You have nowhere else to go. You're mine now, Ada," he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. But Ada's will was stronger than she realized. The fear that had once paralyzed her now fueled her resolve. She would not let him have control over her any longer. She had to escape. In a desperate move, Ada grabbed the first thing she could reach, a small vase from the bedside table, and threw it at him. The vase shattered against the wall and Bayo staggered back, momentarily stunned. Seizing the opportunity, Ada dashed toward the door. Her heart pounded in her ears as she sprinted down the hall, not knowing where she was going, just knowing she had to get away. She reached the stairs and began to descend in a panic, her foot catching on the last step. She tumbled forward, crashing to the ground. Bayo's voice echoed behind her, but she was too disoriented to respond. Ada pushed herself up, scrambling to her feet and running as fast as her legs could carry her, her mind only focused on one thing: freedom. She burst through the front door, into the open air, breathing in the cool night air as though it were her first breath of life. But even as she ran, the darkness of Uncle Bayo's mansion loomed in her mind. She could feel his eyes on her, feel his power, even in her flight. Ada knew her life would never be the same, and the true terror of what Uncle Bayo was capable of had only just begun. In the days following her desperate escape from Uncle Bayo's room, Ada's heart remained heavy with the shock of what had almost transpired. She couldn't help but replay the events in her mind, her uncle's behavior, the terror that had filled her every sense. But despite the fear, a stronger emotion began to surge within her, the need to survive. Ada knew she could no longer remain passive, waiting for Bio to make another move. She had to take control of her own destiny. That night, as the darkness of the mansion crept over her, Ada sat on her bed, staring at the small window that looked out onto the garden. The sound of the distant crickets and the rustling leaves only added to her isolation. But in her isolation, Ada found clarity. She had to do something. She could no longer wait for someone to rescue her. She had to be her own savior. The mansion's sprawling grounds seemed endless in the moonlight, but Ada ran with everything she had. Her legs burned, but she didn't stop. The sound of her footsteps pounding against the gravel path was the only thing she could hear now. The mansion loomed behind her, dark and silent, as she moved further into the night. Ada's only goal was escape. She had to find help. She had to expose Bayo for who he was. Her heart was racing, but a sense of clarity washed over her. This wasn't just about survival anymore, this was about justice. She knew she couldn't keep running forever, but right now, it was all she had. She ran, and she didn't stop. Ada pushed forward, her breath heavy and fast as she reached the edge of the property. There, in the distance, she saw the faint glow of streetlights. Her pulse quickened. She had made it this far, and she would not turn back now. She couldn't afford to. As she neared the street, Ada took a deep breath, gathering the last of her strength. She could hear the faint sound of Bayo's voice calling her name in the distance, but she ignored it. She had to disappear. She had to save herself. Finally, Ada reached the road, the first sign of civilization in what felt like an eternity. Her heart still raced, but now it was a sense of relief that washed over her. She had escaped the mansion. She was free,